You?
Great.
Where do I start? Okay. So you grew up in the DC area, Jewish American background,
Yep.
and very much of a Jewish culinary tradition, I would say, too, having celebrated Shabbat every Friday, which is very similar, let's say, to the Italian Sunday lunch, if you
Yep.
wish. But it's very much of a different culinary tradition. So tell me about that, you're growing up, and how you actually segued from that culinary tradition into pasta.
That's a great question. Well, as a kid, as with most kids, I enjoyed eating pasta all the time. It was definitely one of my favorite foods. But I mean, I will say, yes, I grew up with Shabbat dinners every Friday night. I grew up in a relatively observant Jewish family, but my parents are not cooks per se. My mom is a good cook, but it wasn't like I was, trailing the heels of my grandmother, making, kreplach when I was 5. Definitely didn't have that kind of upbringing, but my parents were very open with me about food. They always encouraged me to try new food. So I was always a very adventurous eater. Then, in maybe when I was 10 and Food Network started coming onto the scene, I became a very avid cook, just sort of experimenting in the kitchen. So food was always such a important part of my childhood, even if it wasn't in the way that a lot of people might think. But, Shabbat was, food aside, was such a huge part of my life. And really a highlight of my week, just a time to unplug and get together with friends and family and enjoy food and just relax. And I think those sorts of connections and environments are rare. So when I decided to transition into the food industry, my first goal was to recreate that feeling and that experience with whatever I was going to do. So I had the idea of like a supper club or some sort of way to bring people together over a love of food and to kind of eliminate that religious element of Shabbat.
So you've made a big leap and left out a lot of steps in your life. So,
I know.
I think I've always loved food, and it's always been a central theme in my life. But you did mention in an interview or in some writing somewhere that when you were growing up, although you do seem to have always had this thrust and interest in food, it wasn't really something that one would be expected to do after graduating from Brandeis with a completely different degree to follow a food path. It was still not like, oh, I'm going to be a chef kind of a thing.
Right, correct. Absolutely.
So how did you make that leap from Brandeis and the degree that you had and your employment, which was it a marketing degree and job that you started off with?
I have a degree in art history and anthropology, and then I actually have a master's in art history from a very small art school in England. So I was definitely set up to be in the art world. I wanted to be a curator at a museum. That was my goal. After I finished my master's degree, I came back to the US and started working in public relations for art museums. So I worked for a few different PR communications agencies in New York City where I was living for about 5 years doing, press releases and strategy for like MoMA and the Met and the Venice Biennale and all of that stuff, which was cool. But that transition happened again after about 5 years, 3 different, agencies thinking, oh, maybe it's the culture of this one that I don't like, so I'll try something else. And while I love art, and actually my focus was in Italian Renaissance art, so I was always interested in Italy and Italian culture.
Meryl, had you traveled here already by then?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
Okay, because I did see that you came to, on your honeymoon.
Yes.
You came and you did a pasta course with your husband in Modena, which is the epicenter for egg-based pasta. but I didn't see any reference to other Italian travel.
Yeah, the first time I went to Italy was probably right around when I graduated high school. I can't remember. But I went with my family, and we did Florence and other parts of Tuscany. We went to Lucca, which has always been a favorite town of mine. We did Siena, Rome. When I was studying in England, I did with my friend. We went to Rome for 2 weeks. So I was familiar. I'd been to the big places, and also for work had gone to Venice. Yes, but I had never gone to Italy with the food focus. Obviously, the food's always amazing, but I didn't, have that pasta eye. I have not been back since that kind of life-changing trip. I mean, there was a pandemic, but I still haven't gotten back, and I just can't wait to come back and meet all these people that I now know and see it through a totally different lens.
So people that you've met online through Instagram and all this kind of a virtual life, which is a very important element. I've made some really close personal friends through Instagram.
Absolutely.
It's such a funny thing. So that's interesting that you haven't been back. So back to your art. So you were doing these art things, and then...
And I realized that when I looked at what my life would be like in 10 years, when I looked at the people who were my bosses, who were working above me, I was just like, I don't want to do this for 10 more years. I don't really see a future in what I was doing. And while I loved art, it was food that I was thinking about on the side. It was cooking projects that I was doing on the weekends. And my husband is also very interested in food and cooking, so we definitely shared that love. And I was like, you know what? I live in New York City. I don't have children. I'm in a position that I might never be in again, where I could make a change if I wanted to. And it was actually my husband who said, well, what do you think about culinary school? Because he knew that was my obsession. And originally I had thought maybe I'll get into food communications and get into it that way. But I didn't want to be behind a desk. I didn't want to be working for clients in that way anymore.
Yeah, you didn't want to do the business side of it.
Right. I wanted to be in the kitchen. Although I studied art history, I made art for my entire childhood. So I wanted to use my hands and do something tactile. And I thought, you know what? I think going to culinary school is that clean break, that starting anew that I really needed to kind of like move on into the industry that I was more interested in. So it was actually my husband who like really made me feel confident in that decision. And that trip to Italy for our honeymoon was actually 2 weeks before I started classes at the Institute of Culinary Education. So I had this, mind-blowing experience in Modena, and I went into culinary school knowing that I wanted to focus on pasta. And just to circle back to the, my Jewish upbringing, I found that pasta suited sort of all of my interests, the artistic part of it, my personal dietary restrictions, which I lay out in the book as well, and also sort of a bridge that could bring lots of different people together and create those Shabbat-like experiences without that religious component, because so many people love pasta, and there is a version of pasta in so many cultures that it really can transcend those boundaries.
So tell us about, you mentioned your dietary restrictions, let's say. Tell us about those.
So I grew up without dietary restrictions at all. So I know what everything tastes like, more or less, which I think is actually the harder thing, is to give it up later in life. My husband has kept kosher his whole life, and so he doesn't know what shrimp tastes like, and I'm like, oh, it's so delicious. But my dietary restrictions have kind of gone on a little roller coaster. When I was 8, we moved into a new house, and my dad had started embracing, Jewish culture a bit more, and said, this house is going to be kosher. So we started keeping kosher in the house. My mom and I still ate lobster out of the house. And then when I was in college, I started spending more time with religious Jews who kept kosher. So I was more influenced to kind of keep it out of the house more as well. And then I actually gave